Thanks everybody for joining us. We're going to wait just a minute or two because we still have some people coming in from the waiting room. So we'll get started just as soon as we get everybody in the session. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for joining us today for our Workplace Investigations 101 seminar. Before I get started with our presentation, I just want to tell you a little bit about our role here, just so that you're aware of it. I am Heather Martin, and then my colleague Connie Kong will also be assisting with the presentation. And at BEH, we wear two different hats for investigations. We help and coordinate and oversee workplace investigations for our regular clients. And then we do workplace investigations for entities that are not our regular clients. So we have some insight on both sides of the coin there. We both also have our Association of Workplace Investigators certificates. So we have gone through, it's basically a week-long training on workplace investigations. And then also before I get into the specifics of the presentation, if you have a question, just put it in the chat and we will hopefully have time at the end to cover those questions. And if you probably later today or tomorrow, Kristen in our office is going to be sending out we're recording this presentation. She'll be sending out a link to the recording and then also the presentation slides. So you should get them. And then also just keep in mind if there's any of these topics, because we're really kind of going to go over everything pretty quickly. But if there's anything that you think it would be helpful for us to go more in depth on, you can also put that in the chat, and maybe we'll have that in a investigation 201 presentation at some time in the future. So on the next slide. On the next slide, we have basically the tenets that I like to keep in mind. I think you should keep in mind for any workplace investigation. And that is that an employer should conduct a prompt, thorough, and impartial investigation when there's basically like workplace wrongdoing that they learn about. This is basically an EEOC guidance. It's more specifically for sexual harassment investigations, but I think if you keep these tenets in mind for any workplace investigation, it's going to guide you in the right direction. So on the next slide, we just have an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We're basically just going to go over the steps for conducting a proper investigation. The first step is decision to investigate. The second are any interim actions that you might want to take. Third is choosing an investigator. 4 is an investigation plan. 5 is conducting the interviews. 6 is documentation of your investigation. And then 7, be a wrap up. Like, what do you have to do once your investigation is finished? And when we're going through all this, we have a scenario that we wanted to put out for you all, just so that we have examples that we can use when we're walking through those steps. So that scenario is on the next slide, and Connie's going to take it from here for a little bit.
Hey, morning, everyone. So we came up with a fun little scenario for us to work through as we go through this presentation. And for you Parks and Recs fans, this one's for you. So we have the city of Eagleton, Oregon, and we have a couple of employees in the Parks department. We have Leslie, who is the department director, and she supervises Ben, the deputy Parks director. So one day, Ben approaches April, a human resources analyst, and tells her he has concerns about Leslie. Ben tells April that Leslie invited him out to dinner on the evening of February 13th to discuss the city's annual Little Sebastian rodeo. Leslie said that if Ben did not attend, he could not be on the organizing committee for the rodeo. All right, next slide. So Ben was hesitant to go because he felt the dinner invite was inappropriate, but he went because the rodeo is his favorite city event and he was excited to plan for it. Ben thinks that Andy, his coworker who sits in the next desk over, might have overheard the conversation about the dinner. Ben also told April that he was afraid to confront Leslie because she could be mean and vindictive. Okay, next slide.
Thank you. So your first step here is deciding, if you put yourself in April's position, to make a decision whether you want to investigate. So right here, I think it's important to keep in mind that you don't need a formal complaint in order to start an investigation. It can be written. Ben might have just submitted this in writing and emailed it to you. It could be oral, like the conversation he had with April, or it could be an observation you yourself had. You saw something happen in the workplace that could be a violation of your workplace policies. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And then also when making that decision to investigate, you want to look at whether you have any facts that are in conflict. Is there more than one side to this story? So here in our scenario, there obviously could be another side to the story. What did Leslie have to say about it? What did Andy observe or have to say about it? Sometimes maybe before you make this decision, you might need to do a more in-depth intake interview. And so from the scenario that we put forth, you had the basic information about the dinner and potentially being on the committee. But then there was also the comment that Ben made about Leslie being like mean and vindictive. And is that something that you want to look into more? So you might want to touch base with Ben again about, what did you mean by that? And what were those instances when that happened? That if you need to look into those issues as well. And, through that process, you also want to make sure that you're reviewing your, employee handbooks, your personnel policies, your collective bargaining agreements to make sure that if there are any requirements for investigations or needing to investigate situations, you've covered them. There are some issues that are raised that are mandatory for you to investigate. That would be harassment, retaliation, or discrimination based on a protected class, an OSHA, like safety violation, or drug and alcohol violations, particularly if you have an individual with the CDL that is involved. So sometimes you might just have a situation that's brought forward that's not necessarily one that needs to be investigated. It could just be friction among coworkers or supervisors. I don't think we really have that here in the scenario we're talking about. But for example, if Ben had gone to April and just said, I'm really upset about my performance review, and Leslie just keeps getting on me because I am not finishing my projects on time, or she's not communicating well with me. So those types of issues that are brought forth, they might not necessitate an investigation and might need to be handled in a sort of a separate path and in a different way. So on the next slide, it's talking about this situation that we have here. Like, should April investigate or move forward with an investigation? And basically related to the allegation that Leslie asked Ben to dinner with her and threatened to withhold a spot on the organizing committee if he didn't go. This is probably something I would definitely want to investigate. This is basically she's withholding some employment benefit for him unless he goes to dinner with her after hours, outside of work hours. It's definitely something you would want to look into. And then the second one, whether Leslie is mean and vindictive. As I mentioned before, this is something where you probably want to get some more details from Ben to find out, what are these specific incidents that you're going to want to look at there. And then oftentimes you look at whether these allegations are related. I think these two issues could be handled, all in one investigation. Sometimes you have somebody come forward with allegations completely different from this. So if Ben had come forward with some separate issues he was having with Andy, his coworker, that are not related to this little Sebastian rodeo or Leslie being mean or vindictive, that might be a separate investigation that you would want to handle differently. So that's what I would do in this situation for sure. Move forward with the little Sebastian incident. Maybe get more information on the mean and vindictive before you do move forward. Next slide.
Okay, so at this point, you've made the decision to investigate an allegation against Leslie. The second step is to figure out if you need to take any interim actions immediately. And interim actions are temporary in nature, and they must be, it's important that they aren't disciplinary in nature and that they be viewed as fair. And there are several reasons why you might want to take some interim actions. For example, you want to protect the people, the employees and property. For example, you might have a scheduling change, or maybe transfer some people, or have a leave of absence, or put someone on paid administrative leave. Again, it's important that these aren't viewed as disciplinary. You might want to preserve evidence. It may be necessary to caution people not to destroy, delete emails, or for example, if there's an allegation that someone has brought drugs into the workplace, you might have to, look into the locker and obtain that evidence of those drugs, if there is any. You want to prevent new problems. And again, this kind of goes back to if the parties are in, for example, in a reporting relationship, you might have to separate those two different parties. It's also very important to consider what you have done in the past. Again, this goes back to being fair and not being disciplinary in these actions. You might want to consider attorney-client privilege issues. As public entities, a lot of the work product that the documents that are created are subject to public records requests. And if it's important to keep things confidential, or maybe this report might be used in litigation, it's important to get your city or county attorney involved early on. And finally, if some allegations you're required to report to the police. For example, if there are allegations related to physical or sexual assault, or some instances of theft and fraud, you'll want to make a report to the police. All right, next slide. So here, in this particular scenario, are there any interim actions that April, the HR analyst, should take? So here we have Ben has made that complaint against Leslie involving the dinner request. Even though they are in a reporting relationship, so far we don't have an idea yet of, has Leslie repeatedly made these kinds of requests, and it would be a problem for Ben to keep reporting to Leslie. And as far as like, for example, preserving any kind of evidence, like again, we not so sure, possibly some emails related to how the organizing committee for the rodeo might be staffed. Uh, so let's add a little bit more to the scenario. Ben tells April that Leslie used the city's credit card to pay for dinner and that she uses it all the time when she goes out to dinner. So with this addition, are there any additional interim actions that we could consider? And possibly we might have to suspend Leslie's city credit card and potentially notify the finance department to preserve credit card statements to see if there has been any misuse. Next slide, please.
So at this point, April's moving forward and she needs to find her investigator. And what do you want to look for when you're choosing an investigator? You want someone who, and just to back up here, we're going to talk a little bit more about this down here, but it can also be like in-house versus external. So just keep that in mind because you want these to apply for an in-house person or an external person. You want somebody who's experienced. You want somebody who is neutral, unbiased, and impartial. You want somebody who has specific training if you need it for specific investigations. And so by that, I mean, so if you have potential fraud allegations, somebody's moving money around or, something like that, where like a forensic investigator might be useful. If somebody has skills like that, that's what you would want to look for. And then, the biggest decision a lot of times is in-house, keeping it in-house or going external. And a lot of our clients, they don't have this, they don't have a huge HR staff that they can choose from in terms of doing investigations. So, their options might be limited in-house, forcing them to go external for investigations. And then you also want to keep in mind attorney-client privilege issues. So when you are, if you decide to go external, you want to make sure probably that you run that contract through your city attorney's office or county attorney's office, just to add additional protection for the report that might come out of that, which could be protected under attorney-client privilege. And that's the same goes for in-house, making sure, you keep your attorney in the loop on the steps you're taking and potentially have them, oversee the investigation. So on the next slide. So if a city, for example, in this case, our Eagleton, Oregon, wants to hire an external investigator, that doesn't necessarily mean that in our situation, April is totally done and she doesn't need to do anything. You'll still want to stay involved with the investigation. And usually that involves sending notices of the investigation to the complainant, witnesses, the respondents, working with the investigator on the scope of the investigation, and then whatever that end work product is that you want to see. And so, do you want a final written report? And in that written report, do you want to have factual findings or do you want factual findings and policy findings? So, working with them through those issues. You'll also want to provide them with any internal policies, your handbooks, your personnel policies, any policies specifically related to the issue that's at hand. So like in our example, if you have policies on the use of like city credit cards, making sure that the investigator gets those policies. And then keeping them informed of any incident that could affect the investigation. So an example there could be, hey, one of these witnesses you want to talk to is going to be going out on medical leave in a couple of weeks or in a week, so you might want to interview them first. Or Ben comes forward with additional information, and you might want to talk to the investigator. Should we add this to the scope? Should this be a separate investigation? Those types of things. And then maybe most importantly, to respond to any concerns of retaliation. Leslie finds out about the investigation, and all of a sudden she is issuing written warnings left and right to Ben. So, just wanting to make sure that you stay on top of that. And then on the next slide, for this scenario, we have several people that could be the investigator. We have April. She's a new HR analyst. She has experience with investigations involving computer forensics. She has completed 3 workplace investigations on her own. And you have Chris, the HR director, who's performed 20 workplace investigations, lives next door to Leslie, and plays on the softball team with her. And by some accounts is really good friends with her. Then you have Donna, who is a longtime HR analyst who's conducted over 50 workplace investigations and doesn't seem to have any direct contact or friendships or supervision situations with any of the people that are involved so far. Or you could hire an external investigator. So for this situation, I think we could have Donna do the investigation. It would also be probably fine to have April do it, or to hire an external investigator. I think Chris is the one that I would not recommend having him do this investigation, because he obviously has some ties to the respondent. On the next slide.
Okay, so at this point you have chosen an investigator, and now it's time to step 4 is making an investigation plan. And this is kind of like the overarching plan you're going to follow as you go through the investigation. So some of the things to keep in mind, you want to keep the scope of the investigation at the forefront. And then I know we've touched upon this before, but you look at the complaint, or what the complainant has said, and you figure out what needs to be investigated. Did that conduct happen? And if the conduct did occur, look to see if any policies may be at issue. And one thing to be aware of is, as you go through investigation, you start interviewing witnesses, things might come up, new facts or things you might not have been aware of. And if they are sufficiently related to the allegations that you're investigating, it should become part of the same investigation. But if they're not related, then that is a separate and possibly new investigation. Just to give you a really brief example, if there's been an allegation of sexual harassment, for example, and let's say new information comes out that the manager only promotes men. Well, that's separate. It's not related to the issue or the allegation of sexual harassment. But let's say the fact comes out that the supervisor only promotes women who agree to go on a date with him. Now that is probably sufficiently related to the allegations of sexual harassment. As you'll want to consider the work product, and what are you presenting at the end of this investigation. You'll want to be making findings of fact, doing analysis of those facts, and then determining if there have been any policy violations. And it's important to be aware that you're not making legal findings. The investigation is not a legal proceeding, and so you want to just keep it to whether or not things have occurred, or the allegation can be sustained, and whether or not there have been some policy violations. Right, next slide. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this, about notices. Notices need to be given to the complainant and the respondent. And in those notices, you want to describe the allegations. And in the case of the respondent, you want to identify potential policy violations. It's important to follow if it involves a union employee, to follow any collective bargaining agreement requirements or any employee handbook requirements. And should, in the case of a union employee, does the employee require or uh, have the right to have a union rep present? And that's from a legal case called Weingarten. If the union employee has a right to a union rep, if the union employee is required to participate in the investigation, which may lead to discipline. Let's see, you'll want to also provide notices to witnesses. And then you'll also want to think about how the order of these interviews. Typically, you start with the complainant, so you can kind of refine the scope of your investigation. And then you'll want to think about people who might have relevant information to the investigation. And finally, you want to interview the respondent last, because at that point in time, you will have gathered all your evidence, any statements, and then you can question the respondent about all of that. As far as what evidence you should be gathering, in the beginning, I think we talked about, gathering organizational charts, employee handbooks and policies, any kind of documentation related to the allegations. Basically, you're looking for relevant evidence, and relevant just means evidence that will help you prove or disprove the allegation. And finally, it might be useful to start an investigation log. And what that just means is, it's just tracking the progress of your investigation. Sometimes investigations can last weeks, and it's easy to forget your progress or things you have done or haven't done. And also, if your investigation has come to a standstill for whatever reason, maybe a witness isn't responding to an interview request, it might be useful to note that down as well to explaining kind of delays. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so applying the investigation plan part of the step to the scenario. What is the scope of the scenario? First, we definitely should investigate whether or not Leslie asked Ben out to dinner and then threatened him to not put him on the rodeo committee if he did not go. We should also definitely investigate whether Leslie is misusing the city credit card. And the third allegation, whether Leslie is mean and or vindictive, I think we kind of touched upon. We probably need a little bit more information about this to see if it's repetitive or has she done this to other employees, being mean and vindictive. So probably you'd have to look into this issue a little bit. Okay, and then once you've decided to investigate the scope of the investigation, if these allegations are true, what policies could they violate? And again, you will need to look to employee handbooks, job descriptions, and any other applicable policies, and then prepare a list of potential violations. All right, next slide. So in terms of who should be interviewed, again, we start with the complainant, and that would be Ben in this scenario. And then we want to think about other witnesses who may have relevant evidence concerning the allegations. And here we definitely want to interview Andy, who Ben said sat in the desk next to him and who might have overheard the conversation, or any other employees who sit nearby who may have overheard the conversation between Leslie and Ben. You'll probably want to interview the finance manager who oversees credit card accounts, maybe the restaurant employees who may have witnessed the dinner. And also you want to ask your witnesses for any recommendations of who they might want to interview. For example, if you are interviewing Andy and he goes, oh, you might also want to talk to Anne, who was also there that day. And then finally, you want to interview Leslie, the respondent. All right, next slide. Okay, what kind of evidence should the investigator be looking for? Obviously, you want to interview the witnesses to Leslie and Ben's conversation, any emails related to how the rodeo organizing committee is selected, and also look into the credit card records. All right, next slide.
Then So you're moving forward, and your next step is to do the actual interviews. And this is really a lot of times the crux of an investigation is talking to potential witnesses and the complainant and the respondent. So, for these interviews, you want to make sure, one, that you provided notice to the individual that you're going to interview. We've already talked about what should be in that. You also want to make sure that you pick a location that's private and neutral. And what I mean by neutral is, so in our scenario here, we want, picking a conference room that's right off of Leslie's office is probably not the best place to do your interviews for this investigation. You can also decide if you want it to be in person versus remote. If you do it in person, you want to make sure that the witnesses are always free to leave, so you avoid any false imprisonment claims. There might be some disciplinary consequences if they decide to leave, but if they want to leave, you should allow them to do that. And before your interviews, you also want to prepare questions. But don't feel like completely like I must follow these questions just as they are. You want to be able to diverge from those and just listen and respond to what the person is saying. And I find it helpful to start with really open-ended questions. So, you're talking to Ben and you start out just like, so, I heard you had a conversation with Leslie about on February 13th, about going to dinner with her. Tell me about that. And then, let him just really kind of tell the story. And then you can drill down on the details, where did you have the conversation? Were there any other witnesses? And then, when he talks about, I did go to dinner, here's what, we did go to dinner and here's what happened. Just drilling down on the details once you get that sort of big picture. And then, the biggest, probably maybe one of the biggest debates that investigators have is whether just to take notes, and that's your recordation of the interview, or to record it. I myself personally prefer to record, and I do that for several reasons. One, I've been burned by it in the past where someone has said, no, I didn't say that, that's not what was said, and you could go back to the tape and there it is. But the more important reason for me is I just think you have more accurate reports in the end if you're not really, sure. I don't, you don't remember exactly what was said or what the question was that you posed to them when they answered it. So it's nice to have that, and you can go back to it. And I think it's just more accurate report in the end, an accurate investigation. And don't be afraid to re-interview them if you need to. Sometimes, I have information that comes out through a later witness that I didn't get to ask someone about. I might need to go back and re-interview them. Or you can just send sometimes just clarification questions to them via email. And then it's not one of the bullets here, but I always like to, like at the end of my conversation with them too, maybe sometimes go over if they've mentioned documentation they want to send to me. I noted it throughout the interview. And so at the end I say, so, you said you would provide me with this email you sent on, X date, and kind of go over the list of things that they're going to get back to you on or send to you. This is the next slide. At the beginning of the interview, I have like a interview checklist that I like to go over. And this is just to make sure like everything is clear for the person that you're interviewing. What the purpose of the investigation is. You don't need to give specifically like witnesses what's going on. It's just like you have relevant information. You might have relevant information, so that's why I'm talking to you. The identity of the investigator and their role. This is particularly important if you have an external investigator who's doing it. And then an admonishment regarding the absence of privacy and potential confidentiality. And I just tell them, a lot of times information needs to be shared in order for me to do a complete investigation and make that clear to them up front. Like what they're telling you is not confidential. You keep it confidential to the extent that you can or whatever's required by any policy that you might have, but make that statement. And then also for all of our clients that we work for that are public agencies, I let them know like all the records that I'm creating, that includes the recording, the report, anything else, they are public records. There might be exemptions that apply to them sometimes, but I like to make that clear to them upfront as well. And then always important to have an admonishment about retaliation to make sure, if they feel they're being retaliated against for participating, that they know who they should bring those concerns to. For me, as an external investigator, it's usually whoever my contact is there with the client. And then, internally here, for our example, we're using like for Donna, in this case, you might have like April be the person, like contact April if there's any issues. And then, of course, at the beginning, if you are recording it, letting them know that it is being recorded. And then the last piece is basically guarantee warning. So that is going to be necessary if you have potential criminal conduct that might be at issue. And we could probably do a session. I could go on about guarantee warning and talk about some of the issues that come up with that and the situations, which I'm not going to go into detail here. But it's basically, if there is criminal conduct that's involved, basically telling the employee that they need to answer the questions, but also indicating that you're not going to be providing that information to law enforcement in a criminal action against them. And you really should have like a form guarantee warning for your organization that you're using in these situations so that there's no question of it. It's uniform, but just something to be aware. So on the next slide, in our scenario that we have here, do we have any concerns when we're interviewing Leslie? So based on what we know so far, I don't think we're going to need to do a guarantee warning for her. Maybe, with the unauthorized use of the credit card, but it wasn't an allegation that she's, embezzling money from the city or taking money from the city. So right now, I don't think so. She's going to be the last person that we want to interview. You want to talk to everybody else first so that you have everything and you can ask her about, all of the other information that you've gathered up to that point. So we talked to Ben and Andy. Maybe a really important piece for them is going to be making sure that, because both of them in our scenario report to Leslie, making sure they're aware of the retaliation policy. And then, so while we're doing our interviews, when Andy was interviewed, he said, Leslie regularly calls him a scatterbrain. And Leslie says she knows why Andy needs to take ADHD medication because he's too lazy without it. So this isn't really directly related to our investigation, but this might be something that's like, this might be something that the client wants to look into more. So if I'm an external investigator, I might contact the person, my contact there, and say, this came up, this could be an issue for bringing up his ADA medication issue. Then it might be something you want to look into separately. It might be a separate investigation. But just something to be aware of that happens, when you have these interviews, there might be some things that come up. And these could also be things where, sort of at the end, at least as an external investigator, I usually like to maybe just keep a list of these things that come up during my conversations with witnesses that are outside the scope of the investigation, but might be something that, they want to be aware of, and it might be something they want to look into separately. So next slide. Next, yeah, there we go.
Okay, so at this point, your probably doing interviews, and it's important at this point to be really good about documenting your investigation. Because at this point you're gathering lots of information, you're doing interviews, and the investigation is likely to last a couple of weeks or more. And it's just important to keep organized because what evidence you're gathering and the find are going to help you make these findings at the end in your final report. So keeping that in mind, most likely your final product is going to be a report. And so it's helpful to begin to kind of organize yourself in that kind of form. First, you always want to identify the scope, and because that will help you determine what evidence is relevant or not. And you want to perhaps give a little background information about, how the parties are related. Like, for example, Ben reports to Leslie, having that kind of just background information into the report. You also want to describe what documentary evidence you're collecting. That could be, for example, employee handbooks, any policies that might be at issue. You want to have a little section of that for your report. You want to start summarizing your interviews. Most likely you'll be interviewing multiple people, and you'll have a section on people interviewed, and it would help to go person by person and say, okay, this is a summary of what information was gathered. You'll also be making factual findings and doing an analysis of that. And we'll go, and in that process, you'll have to be making credibility determinations. And the next slide, I'll focus a little bit more on that. And it's also very important to remember that you need to be impartial as you go through this investigation. And then finally, you'll want to come to a conclusion. Did a certain event happen, or is the allegation sustained? That's the job of the investigator, that at the end of this investigation, after all the interviews, after gathering all this evidence, did something happen? All right, next slide, please. So going back to credibility factors. So we use these factors when we're trying to weigh or trying to determine if a particular piece of evidence is more credible than another. Not all of these factors will apply to every piece of evidence that you're analyzing. And these factors are roughly listed in terms of the strongest to the weakest. And so I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what each of these factors means. So first, corroboration or lack thereof. This kind of evidence is like physical or tangible evidence. For example, emails, reports, witnesses, some witness statements, anything that's been documented contemporaneously, like, for example, if an employee made notes or kept a journal. Or, for example, if a person told someone about an incident right after it happened. Those are all kinds of evidence that can corroborate directly. A second factor could be the opportunity or capacity to observe. And this mainly questions, did the witness have personal knowledge of the particular fact that you're trying to obtain? For example, did they hear that conversation directly, or were they told about that conversation secondhand? Third factor, consistent or inconsistent statements. For example, if the witness says one thing, but then 15 minutes later says the opposite. And an example of this is, for example, if a person says, oh, that employee is a terrible worker, but then this employee has been given good performance reviews in the past by that same person. Another factor is past history. Something that happened in the past could be relevant. For example, if the allegation is of harassment, maybe there has been a prior complaint of harassment against this person. Next factor, plausibility. This relates to could that is it likely that conduct could have occurred? And this kind of relates to who has knowledge, who is the best person to possess this kind of knowledge, or how are things generally done? And a good example of this is, for example, if a manager sends out a weekly staff email, it's not plausible that one staff member didn't get that email. Next factor is bias. Bias can cut both ways. It could go in favor or against a person or an outcome. Example, if a witness is asked about a coworker's promotion, and you know that this witness and the coworker are friends, and if the statement is like, oh, for example, Ben totally deserved that promotion, but you know that they're friends, and bias could be involved in that. Next factor, does that person have a motive to lie? Most likely, if you think about anybody, they could have a motive to lie, but it's important to realize that not everyone will act on that motive. Common motives to lie, for example, in the case of the respondent, there's a fear of discipline. In the case of reporting, making a complaint against a manager, there could be a fear of retaliation. A next factor, a reputation or for truth, for being honest or deceitful. As we get down further to these factors, they're not as strong to determine credibility. And this one is like, for example, if a coworker is known to be dramatic or exaggerates all the time, it's important to consider the source of that kind of information. The manner of responding to questions. For example, if is the person evasive or doesn't answer your question directly? And I can give you an example of this. If the question is, were you at the meeting? And the person says, I always go to meetings. Well, that doesn't really directly answer the question. Or if they said, oh, meetings happen every Monday, or why wouldn't I? Those are very evasive kinds of answers to that question. And the last factor is demeanor. And we do not recommend that you base credibility determinations on this last factor. And by demeanor, we mean like body language or any kind of physical reactions during the interview. And for example, is the person calm or hostile? Are they nervous? Do they not make eye contact? And you can probably guess that a lot of these physical reactions, there could be multiple reasons for why that person doesn't make eye contact or appears nervous. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not telling the truth. So again, please, don't recommend that you rely on demeanor. All right, next slide. Burden of proof. And by burden of proof, it just means is there sufficient evidence to support the allegation that, for example, that the conduct did occur. Here we've listed a few different burdens of proof, and they are ranked in terms of the lowest burden to the highest burden. And for example, preponderance of the evidence. That is when something is more likely true than not. And if you want to think about it as 51%, kind of like tipping the scale over to like, yes, there's enough evidence that this particular thing did happen or is true. Then the second burden, clear and convincing evidence. This is higher than preponderance. And sometimes if you collective, in the case of a new employee, their collective bargaining agreement may require this higher standard burden of proof for making a finding of fact. Last burden of proof is called beyond a reasonable doubt, and you've probably heard about this. This is mainly used in criminal cases. And again, it's just beyond a reasonable doubt that something did occur. Normally in investigations, we use the preponderance of the evidence. Like, has the scale been tipped? Like, is there just a little bit more evidence to show that something did really occur or the allegation is sustained? But again, be aware if in the case you want to look at collective bargaining agreements or even employee handbooks to see if a different burden of proof is required during the investigation. All right, next slide.
So for our scenario here, so in our final, we're done our interviews, we're putting together our final documentation. we'll want to have our scope. That'll be, did Leslie invite Ben to dinner and threaten him if he did not attend? Did Leslie make unauthorized purchases on the city credit card? We found out through our investigation, Ben didn't have any examples of when Leslie was mean or vindictive, so we don't have that in our scope anymore. Then in our background information, we'll put there, how did the city receive the complaint? What policies are at issue? What's the investigation process? And by that, I like to put in there, who did you interview? What evidence did you review? When did you interview people? Did they have a union representative with them? Were they in person? Was it on the phone? Just noting those types of things so you have all of those issues covered. And then last, it'll be like the evidence, the documents, and if you want interview all the documents that are reviewed, any other evidence that you looked at, for example, would be emails or the finance, the credit card statements, things like that. So on the next slide, so you're working through your trying to make your determinations here, like who's when you talk to Leslie, she debunked everything Ben said. During the interviews, Andy says he remembers overhearing a conversation between Ben and Leslie about Little Sebastian Rodeo, but he said he got distracted by a TikTok video that popped up on his phone that his coworker Tom sent him, so he didn't catch everything that was said. So, take this into account, and we're looking at our facts. Andy's account might not be complete. We might not be able to rely on that wholly, just understanding he didn't hear the whole conversation. It's just something to keep in mind when we're putting our, analysis together of the facts. And then, as part of the investigation, you obtained the city's credit card statement that verified Leslie had made a charge in the amount of $80 at Eagleton's Little Italy restaurant on February 13th. And that amount is what Ben remembered the bill to be. So here you have some more corroborating evidence for what Ben said, which you can take into account in your analysis. So on the next slide, when you interviewed Leslie, she stated she could not have gone to dinner with Ben that night because it was February 13th and she had an annual Galentine's dinner with her best friend, Anne. So as a result of this conversation, you added Anne to the witness list, even though she's not a city employee. And just to note here, Anne doesn't have to cooperate with the investigation because she's not a city employee, but you can still, attempt to talk to her and get information from her. And she does talk to you. She says she had a Galentine's dinner with Leslie on February 13th. So this goes against what Ben said. But as we talked about, we're looking at some of those factors. Is Anne biased towards Leslie because they're friends? And also, when you're looking at the information you've gathered, you reviewed several emails related to the Little Sebastian Rodeo Committee. And Leslie sent an email to the initial members on February 12th, stating that she might add Ben to the committee, but needed to discuss it with him the next day first. So here you have some more evidence that corroborates Ben's version of the story. It's also something Leslie's saying that's supporting it, that she did talk to him, at least we know, on February 13th about the Little Sebastian Rodeo issue. The next slide. So then you have to make your factual findings. What are your factual findings here? And then do you need more information to make a determination? So like in this case, it might have been, we have these things. Ben said he was with Leslie at dinner. Leslie said she was with Anne. So that's when you might want to try to talk to the restaurant people to determine, if either of them saw Leslie there, who was she with? That's the kind of information you might want to gather so that you can really make a determination and make a factual finding. And so then you would want to look at, did Leslie ask Ben to dinner and threaten him if he did not attend? And a lot of our facts are pointing to, she probably did. Again, this might depend too on what Andy overheard, but you probably have evidence to make a finding there. And then did Leslie use the city credit card for unauthorized purposes? And so here too, you're going to have to look at what are unauthorized purposes. If your city policy, if the city policy allows them to use it for personal expenses and she wasn't asking for a reimbursement, then, maybe not. And then, looking holistically there, did Leslie violate any policies? And then next slide. And this one is just, wrapping up, the investigation. You want to review your report and findings. You'll have to decide who's going to see the report. Less is more. In this situation, it would probably just be Leslie's supervisor, the city manager, and then look at, what steps you want to take. Is discipline warranted or necessary? And then once you've made a decision on how you're going to go, which direction, you're going to follow up with the complainant and the respondent to let them know the results of the investigation. And through that process, you want to make sure you're following your employee handbook policies, collective bargaining agreements in terms of what you need to provide them. And then, you want to think if there's any larger issues you want to address, like department or employer-wide training that might be necessary. Maybe it's not clear what the city credit card policy is, so it might be something you want to follow up citywide and making sure everybody understands what that is. And then I think it's always important to follow up. Let a period of time has gone on. Following up with the respondent to make sure if you had some sustained findings, to make sure that it's not continuing. For the respondent and complainant, but the complainant mainly to make sure it's not continuing, and then the respondent just to make sure, whatever discipline you impose, they're following that. If you put them on performance improvement or required training, making sure that they've done that. So that is our presentation. I think we do have some questions that were in the chat, which maybe we addressed. The first question we have is what should be in the notice of investigation? And I think we addressed that a little bit later in the presentation. And I think just one point to make here is I think it's helpful to have a sort of format that you use, like when you have a respondent and have like a form notice that you use where you update it with specific information. Same thing for the complainant or for witnesses. And then the next question was recording subject to public records requests. Yes, I think we answered this too in a later slide, but yeah, all the records that internally or even externally that are being created, including the recording, are public records. Like I said, there could be exemptions that apply to those, but I think it is safe to treat them as public records there. And then the last one is there a training recommend for a new person, a person new to HR and investigations? To ask about what types of questions you should ask during an investigation and how to ask questions during an investigation. This could be something we could go in more in depth on with the Investigations 201. I found AWI, the Association of Workplace Investigators, to be super helpful. They have trainings that they do pretty regularly, and even trainings that are aimed at public employers, which would be important for our client. And a lot of times they have things where you can actually do work through actual investigation scenarios in some of their trainings, which I think would be helpful in that area. And then what guidance would you recommend when employees ask for HR's recording of the interview? and are asked to record the session themselves. So we always, so when I'm an external investigator and they ask for the recording, I always say that's the client's decision. Typically, we would provide the recording to them if they ask for it. And a lot of times, a lot of our clients have collective bargaining agreements where they have to provide the recording to them. So again, look at what the policy is and make sure you follow that. But typically, we do allow it. And I think, too, I will say, if they want to record it and you are not planning to record it, I would recommend that you record it too, just so you have a record of it. You can just do that on your phone and some things. Then we have, can you please review the directive that can be given to witnesses not to discuss the investigation to protect its integrity? You can still do that. The reason we didn't put this in here, I would never say, do not discuss this investigation with anyone. What I always say is we ask you not to discuss this investigation or the questions I've asked you outside of our interview today to maintain our investigative process. That's usually what I do. And then I always recommend, putting some verbiage like that in that notice that you have for the employee. So I think those are the questions. Sorry, we're kind of speeding through them because we didn't have too much time there at the end. But yeah, and if you think of something else that might be helpful to do more in depth on some of these things that I was just rushing through here at the end with my trying to answer your questions, let us know. We can do maybe like a 201 and talk more about that. I think people always have questions about that, garrity warnings about what should we take into account, like putting an employee on paid leave, should we do that? Like those types of things. I think we could definitely talk about some of these issues more in depth. But we appreciate you all coming. Kristen will be sending this out. And if you do have any other questions, you can always feel free to shoot them our way. And thanks for coming, everybody.